Why don't we get underway?
Hopefully.
I'll come over. I'm going to keep. I could ask you to take your seats.
Yeah. Are we okay here?
Good morning. I'm James Galbraith. I was for 20 years the chair of Economists for Peace and Security. And I wish to welcome you here to our annual symposium on policy challenges. We've come through a long, bitter, hateful, and frankly repellent campaign, emerging now with all the same problems that were present before. The work of Economists for Peace and Security has always been to confront and define these problems, to work out a path forward. We take up that work, that challenge again this morning. In that spirit, we organized this morning into three parts. A panel on achieving peace, a panel on building jobs, improving wages, and preserving economic security, and a panel on controlling climate change. Whatever political leaders may say, these issues define our time. They will not go away, and neither will we. Politics, nevertheless, does change things. And as we turn to the first issue, I would like to read part of the remarkable statement made the other day by the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, who wrote that, I quote, "Germany and America are bound by common values, democracy, freedom, as well as respect for the rule of law and the dignity of each and every person, regardless of their origin, skin color, creed, gender, sexual orientation, or political views. It is based on these values," she wrote, "that she extended the cooperation of Germany, of herself personally, and of the German government to the United States." A more clear statement of independence, of the end of empire, and the end of automatic deference could not, I think, have been made. Whether these principles continue to apply here in the United States is a question on which our future as a nation now rides. It is a question that transcends economics, yet it has an economic dimension. And we take up that dimension in the second panel. And it has a geophysical or an environmental dimension, a dimension related to the world around us. And we'll take up that dimension in the third panel. There's a question that unifies these two panels, the second and the third. And that is a question of whether policy, in the form of law and regulation, in the pursuit of common goals, has a legitimate role in our national, public, and social life. There is a cult of unregulated markets. It has some presence in the economic profession, some presence in the political sphere. Behind that cult, or closely allied with it, is a practice of government by lobbyists, of essentially turning over the regulatory function to those who have the least interest in seeing it pursued. This is a phenomenon that I described some years ago as the predator state. If you believe in either one of these two closely allied doctrines, the unregulated market or government by the regulation by the regulated, then I have a suggestion for you. Stop taking your blood pressure medication. Drain the oil from the engine of your car. Run your nuclear reactors without a cooling system. Abolish the police. And see what will happen by and by if you try to live on that basis. In this small organization of professional economists, we believe that justice, equality, freedom, and prosperity require law and regulation based on common purpose and on the practical realities of the world. And in that beleaguered spirit, I turn the gavel to the chair of Economists for Peace and Security, Reaearch Kaufman, and the floor to the first panel to discuss the first of the major issues that we have to face this morning. Thank you once again for coming, and look forward to the discussion.
Good morning, everybody. I am Reaearch Kaufman. I spent about 32 years on Capitol Hill long ago when the Congress was constituted and inclined in a quite different way than it is at present. On the leaders, however, who vary from one administration to the other. And I feel that we're now back to a time when we did have Republican leadership, if not dominance, of our federal government and national policies. I'll start by just making a few comments about recent events and President-elect Donald Trump, and also comment about our relations with Russia, and then turn it over to the panelists. President-elect Donald Trump has made strong statements about a variety of national security issues and the question of war and peace generally, accompanied, however, by weak arguments to support most of his positions. And he has sometimes seemed to reverse those positions. With regard to the military, he has repeated his pledge to make us, quote, so strong, nobody's going to mess with us. He has also suggested that he could make us that strong without increasing defense spending. At least at one time, he indicated that. In a Meet the Press interview not long ago, he said quote, "You know what? We could do it for a lot less by reducing waste, fraud, and abuse." He even criticized defense contractors at that time for forcing the Pentagon to buy weapons it did not need or do not work well. More recently, he has, as they say, flip-flopped and proposed actions that would sharply increase defense spending. For example, he has advocated increasing the size of the Army, increasing the number of naval ships, and increasing the number of fighter aircraft. It is estimated that those proposals alone would increase defense spending by as much as $900 million over the next 10 years. As an aside, it should be noted that he seems to have a habit of promising to do more for less. Just last night on the CBS show 60 Minutes, Mr. Trump said he would replace Obamacare with a program that would be better and cost less. However, he may have learned by now that you can't do that with the military. You cannot enlarge it without enlarging the military budget. And it might be useful to look back on our history since World War II and the more or less steady increase in the size of the military and the amount of military spending, with brief downturns after each of our wars, including the Cold War. We can't be sure the pattern will hold in the Trump administration, but there are signs pointing to another defense budget surge that would be offset by cuts in non-defense social programs, perhaps even Medicare and Social Security, which he has vowed to protect. At this point, no one can say what Trump will do. So we need to have a limited wait-and-see approach to national security and many other issues. I mentioned Russia. Despite the fact that we do not have the same values as Russia, it is not a good idea to demonize it. We learned, or should have, during the Cold War, to try to get along with our major adversary. Mr. Trump, in a strange way, may at least slow and possibly stop the drift towards extreme animosity in our relations with Russia. We need to remind ourselves that Russia is a major nuclear power, and that makes just two of us. And also, that it was another Republican president, Ronald Reagan, who entered into a far-reaching and constructive nuclear arms agreement with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russian leader. Now, those of us who remember Reagan and his era know how difficult it was to suffer through the economic difficulties and other problems his policies caused. But at least he understood the importance of maintaining a fairly decent relationship with our primary adversary. Those who counsel otherwise today are advocating a dangerous path. I will now let the panelists make their statements and introduce themselves as they proceed. Mark, do you want to start off?
Sure. Thanks, and thanks for everyone who organized this. You know, I'm Mark Weisbrot, and co-director at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. So I'm going to talk about Latin America, not try not to overlap here. I've been paying attention to it for the last 15 years. And I have to say, on a daily basis, U.S. policy, I'll focus on that. I mean, we write a lot about the individual economies as well, but and I have to say I really appreciate this forum because it's so rare that you have in this town any kind of honest discussion about U.S. foreign policy, and especially in Latin America. I think almost everyone you see on television is either working for the U.S. government or a former government official, or they're getting money from the U.S. government. And there was there have been a couple of reports in the New York Times in the last couple of years about foreign influence, for example, on the think tanks here. I don't know if anybody saw them, one in particular. And they missed the main point of it, which is that all the foreign governments that were influencing and funding the think tanks here were allied, almost all of them were allies of the United States, so they were just adding money to push them in the same direction that they were already going to be close to the U.S. government policy. So let me just summarize the U.S. policy towards Latin America since it's moved. I'm sure most of you know that since 1998, a whole number of left governments have been elected. Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, elected and re-elected. Uruguay, Paraguay, Ecuador, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Argentina, Brazil. And so the strategy of both the Bush and Obama administrations has been relatively simple. It's been containment and rollback. And now we're in the rollback phase. And I predicted that any government that was elected would become more aggressive after the U.S. elections. They tend to be a little more cautious right before an election here because they don't want to cause some kind of trouble. For example, in Venezuela, it's a little bit unpredictable what could happen if there's violent conflict and things like that. And so, there was a great interview with Rafael Correa, the president of Ecuador, just a couple of months ago, and he was asked about the U.S. elections, and he said, well, I think it would be better for Latin America if Trump were elected. And he was very gracious and diplomatic about it. He said, for the sake of the United States, I hope that Hillary wins. But his logic was irrefutable for the short run, and that is that he knew from the experience of the Obama administration and the Bush administration that policy towards Latin America would be basically the same, and no matter who was elected. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which I could go into if we have time. And so in the short run, it's much better for them to have someone like Bush, who got very bad press in Latin America and was very disliked in the media and everywhere, rather than somebody like Obama, who is presented very well in the media and is generally liked in the world. And there's just no way around that. I think that's true. I did say, though, that in response to that in the longer run, of course, it's even worse for Latin America to have Trump, because the Republican Party has a different base in the United States, and as U.S. foreign policy changes in the coming years, however slowly in Latin America, it will be better to have that base and that leadership, which is, obviously most of the neoconservatives are Republicans and so on. And there are some people now who say that, like Francisco Rodriguez, who's one of the best analysts of the economy in the Andean region, he argues that it is possible that Trump will be better for Latin America because he's more isolationist. I don't really think so. I think he's going to he's going to leave it, as Obama did, mostly to the various agencies, the State Department, the Pentagon, the 17 intelligence agencies, the foreign policy committees of Congress. And they have the same agenda, which right now is to get rid of all the left governments and make sure they never come back. And you can see that Matthias will talk about Brazil. so I won't say much about that. But in Argentina, for example, the President Obama went to Argentina and praised the new after Macri was elected, and then the multilateral loans from the Inter-American Development Bank. They tried to block them from the World Bank, and this was all lifted immediately. And now, of course, you have in Argentina the government is being, remember when Trump said about putting Hillary in jail? Well, they're trying to do that with the former president, and they're actually indicted Christina Kirchner and the former head of the central bank and the former finance minister for something that is literally a normal central bank operation. You can read the judge's opinion. There's no crime there whatsoever. There's no allegation of corruption or anybody getting any money or any profiting from it was basically a foreign exchange operation. And so, and of course here in Washington, you don't see a word about this or what happened to the parliamentary coup in Brazil from any of the human rights groups. Okay, so I have 1 minute left. let me say 1 minute about 1 minute about Venezuela, because the United States policy has been extremely consistent and been trying to overthrow this government for 15 years, and now they have a chance because the economy is a total wreck, or they think they have a chance, and so they've been more aggressive, and they actually have sanctions against Venezuela. And everybody says, well, President Obama had to declare for the second time in March that this country proposed an extraordinary and unusual security threat to the United States, which is of course ridiculous, and that actually makes a difference, and then they've actually been blocking Treasury and other agencies have been trying to block U.S. financial and successfully block international financial institutions from carrying out transactions from Venezuela. So that's a big thing that's going on that nobody also pays attention to and doesn't care about. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Matthias?
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Matthias Renengo. I'm, as of now, from Bucknell University and was before at the Central Bank of Argentina for 8 and a half. And yeah, if I can do a little bit of marketing, I have a blog called Naked Keynesianism, which actually refers to Jamie's teachings at the University of Texas, and his poisoning of the youth of Texas with his Keynesian ideas. And at some point, I thought I was at that time teaching in Utah, that I was also poisoning the minds of fairly reasonable conservative Mormon kids. And so I might as well call the blog Naked Keynesianism. And some of the stuff I'm going to briefly talk, which is about Latin America, and it's essentially in the same lines of what Mark has been talking. But I want to talk about Brazil. There is an old saying, I think it was Nixon, maybe it was LBJ, that said that as goes Brazil, goes Latin America. So I think Brazil is an important example of what to expect when you see the slow collapse of a progressive coalition in power. Also one that was, if anything, too moderate and too acceptant of neoliberal ideas. So, which at the end of the day, if you compare the Brazilian experience with some of the other Latin American experiences, that I think is part of the problem. So, first of all, there was a coup. I mean, I don't know how clear that is, but there was a coup in Brazil, a new kind of coup that has been sort of widely used around the globe. So there might be discussions of whether in Ukraine we have something similar or not, but it's a judicial, media-driven rather than military-driven coup, and certainly with support of, or at least some influence of government, U.S. government institutions in this sort of change to the right in Latin America and to the coup in Brazil. So we do know, because of the leaks by Snowden, that the NSA and the CIA were involved in espionage of the Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff. The second of the two, most popular is of course Lula, of the Brazilian Workers' Party's presidents. We also know that they've been spying Petrobras, the Brazilian oil company, and that has been denied, but the evidence is fairly clear that there was some economic espionage associated to this. The reasons are not difficult to understand. So you had in Brazil a reestablishment with the commodity oil boom. You had a reestablishment in several of these countries of either directly nationalization of natural resources or more control over the natural resources, which was the basis, if you want, for the expansion of spending on social policies. In the case of Brazil, there was also a huge discovery of deep sea oil and natural gas resources. And this, by the way, as soon we have 4 months of the new government in Brazil, so much, and they already rolled that back in Congress. So they already allowed for foreign firms to explore oil in Brazil without the 30% participation required from the national oil firm. Also, the independent policy that the Workers' Party, in terms of foreign policy, with the creation of the BRICS, of Bank of the BRICS, it has $100 billion in China, was something seen by, as he said, not just by Republicans. Remember, Lula started in 2003, but also by Democratic administrations as being something negative. If you think of the legacy of Obama towards Latin America, you have to remember that he signed free trade agreements with Colombia. Without Conetta, that's the only one that has been during Obama. Am I missing someone? I think that's that. Peru was with Bush, and CAFTA too precedes this. So that's the only one. But in terms of trade policy, certainly could continue in the sort of direction of free trade policies. But also support for two more explicit coups, the one in Honduras and the one in Paraguay. And certainly all sorts of support for changes in elections, like support for newspapers and whatnot in places like Argentina. So those are, if you want, the reasons behind this. There's a third reason, which I actually, what I wrote here is criminalize economic behavior that is normal. In the case of Brazil was fiscal policy. Set here in Argentina's exchange rate, which is what he alluded about. It was a common exchange rate operation in the Central Bank of Argentina. By the way, if anybody profited from that in Argentina is the current conservative president Macri, who one of his companies, we know that he bought a currency in future dollars in future markets, and when he depreciated, he made a killing in futures. So he's criminalizing the behavior of the ex-president, and the reason is he doesn't want her to be president again. And the same is being done in Brazil, by the way. But they are the ones profiting from this. So I probably don't have too much time, so I should jump. So those are the reasons of why this happened, with the support, I should say, of progressives in the U.S., particularly connected to the Democratic Party. So what are the consequences of the unraveling of this, broad sort of left of center, governments in Latin America, and in particular Brazil? So first of all, it's important to remember that this is happening in a context in which the dollar has been appreciating over the last 2 years, and that has gone hand in hand with a decrease in the price of commodities, and so that has restricted the space for left of center policies in the region. But I should say there is still significant amount of global liquidity. So there is no external crisis per se in the horizon. None of these countries is on the verge of a crisis. The only one actually that was sort of on the verge of a crisis was Argentina, because of the restrictions imposed by the US, and also because Argentina had unsolved issues with the vulture funds. And that restricted the ability to borrow internationally. But Brazil, for example, has no external problem to speak of. And that's true for almost, or was true for almost every country up to very recently. So it's not a crisis in the same sense that you had in the 80s, with the debt crisis, or even the crisis that go from 94 to 2002, from tequila to the Argentinian default, which were also quite, we had the Asian, the Russian, all of those crises happening at that time, in which the external economy was sort of not helping, and the limits of the domestic policies were imposed by the external economy. So these are things that are essentially associated to the domestic economy, and I would suggest in the case of Brazil, essentially connected to income distribution. So for the Workers' Party, with all of its limitations, and there were many, the minimum wage increased more than 50% over the 12 years of the Workers' Party in power. You have an increase in the participation of wages, which, again, it's not fantastic. Brazil is still a very unequal country. It brings it back more or less to what we had back in the 80s, but it's a significant increase. It was 6-7% of in participation in GDP of the share of wages. And what we didn't achieve was significant. It was an increase in growth in Brazil, not as big as in some other countries in the region. In part for the reasons I suggested, because the Workers' Party accepted a good chunk of the neoliberal policies. But what you have now is the return of a predatory elite. So here I want to echo what Jamie said at the introduction, that what we'll see in the US probably is this return of the predator state. The predator state probably was invented in Brazil, so you didn't create that. And so you have elites preying on the resources of the state. If you look at what that means essentially in the financialized world that we live, it means that interest rates in Brazil are probably the highest real interest rates in the world. That goes, the owners of public debt are a minor fraction of the population. What's spent on the interest on public debt, it's about probably double, probably 6-7% of GDP. It's probably double of what's spent on the Bolsa Familia, the big social programs of the Workers' Party that went to 11 million families, which, by the way, are being cut drastically as we speak. So what you'll see with this slow collapse of this sort of moderately progressive government in Brazil is a worsening of income distribution, cut in social spending, an increase in financial spending, which in the case of the US may be associated rather than finance, since the Fed is still independent, to what Richard was commenting at the beginning, some sort of, in the case of the US, some sort of military Keynesianism, and which, by the way, here is one of the instruments of the predator state, contractors and whatnot. So that seems to be the sort of direction that the Latin American economies are taking in general, in the sense that we'll have lower growth, worsening of income distribution, and foreign policy that it's more aligned with business interests in the US. So if I may then comment a little bit on what, which I think it's an important issue, on what Mark was suggesting, the issue of what are the consequences of Trump for Latin America, and whether Correa was right in suggesting that at least in the short run, Trump would be better for Latin America. I would add that one of the positive things that Correa might have had in the back of his mind is that Republicans tend to be more concerned with other parts of the world when they come to power. And so there is a certain benign neglect of Latin America, and probably excepted Mexico, which is too close, and the issue of immigration sort of hits them directly. But there is a benign neglect with respect to what happens in other parts of the world, whereas Democrats have been certainly more engaged in what happens in Latin America, and because they also have accepted the sort of one of the premises of American foreign policy, that it's the support of American business interests abroad, that has had detrimental effects for progressives in the region. In general, though, if I had to say the long-term effect that concerns me the most, which I think, I'm Argentinian, even though I grew up in Brazil, that concerns Latin Americans is the issue of human rights. And on that aspect, in general, Democrats have been much better, going back to Jimmy Carter. Not always, I should say, but the only silver lining of Obama's visit to Argentina is that he fell short of recognizing U.S. responsibility in the military coup in Argentina in '76, and the brutal sort of repression and the disappearance of 30,000 people. So he said that government, U.S. government sometimes don't live up to American values, and that's probably one of the things that the presidency, the limitations that the president imposes on the incumbent. But that's the silver lining. So it's the only thing that he said that he said he was again back in Latin America to promote. I would say the thing that he was doing there. I think that's the ulterior motive of his visit was to promote again the free trade area of the Americas, which was that with Mr. Bush back in 2004, 2005, I think it was the meeting when Chavez and Kirchner sort of killed that FTA. The other thing is, it seems, again, there is an incredible degree of uncertainty about what Trump will do, but it seems that part of the neoliberal agenda is on the retreat, so that Trump will not push for a free trade area of the Americas. But I wouldn't be that happy because the point when we talk about free trade is that most of the damage is already done. So we have that when you look at the Pacific coast, the U.S. has free trade agreements with every single country with one exception, Ecuador, and that country is dollarized. And there are a few. You have El Salvador there in the Pacific too, that it's dollarized and has a free trade agreement with the U.S. And all of a sudden, the neoliberal project for Latin America makes the European project, with all of its defects, look great. Because the project was dollarization, in which you have no vote in the central bank, and free trade agreements, which have draconian rules, much worse than the European Union. So that was the American elites and a good chunk of the Latin American elites project for unification or integration, whatever you want to call it, globalization. And that part seems to be out of the agenda. So the questions I think we have to, and I'll finish here because my time is up. I'll finish with this quote. This was quoted in the New York Times a couple of days before the election. Actually, I didn't notice that, but it was, I think, Dean Baker at CPR's blog that had this. And it's a quote from an economist. And I think it's important to think of the role economists have. After all, we're economists for peace and security. And it's from Daron Acemoglu at MIT. And he said the following thing. As long as the Democratic Party shakes off its hardcore anti-market pro-union stance, there is a huge constituency of well-educated, socially conscious Americans that will join in. Yeah, that didn't work out very well. So the point of this is that progressives, both in the US and in Latin America, will have to rethink, particularly in the US, what kind of coalition we can bring that includes, again, the people that have lost over the last 30 years because of neoliberal policies and the brutal effect of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm Carl Conetta from the Project on Defense Alternatives, which is at the Center for International Policy. Our president-elect has promised us a lot of winning. In fact, he said that there's going to be so much winning that we'll get bored with it.
I'm already bored.
I could use a little boredom, but I think mostly I feel nauseous. I was in Arkansas on the night of the election. I've been there for the past week. It's family business, but I had a lot of opportunity to talk to people who are not Washington people, who are people that really don't agree with my politics. It's an interesting range of opinion that I found about why people felt they needed to support Trump. I will say that there wasn't celebration. I didn't see celebration. I saw life as usual. I was in the town of Waldron, which is about an hour south of Fort Smith. It used to be a big center for timber and cattle. They're still doing that, but it's mostly a worn downtown. One good friend, a very strong Christian person, said he pushed aside all the vitriol that we've been hearing. He doesn't like that. For him, the principal reason was that, and it's really quite idiosyncratic, Trump is a businessman. And this person in particular was very concerned about contractors, that contractors were exploiting government, and maybe because Trump was a businessman, he'd take care of that. I've heard a number of odd and idiosyncratic reasons for supporting Trump. And what I think is important for us to know and to think about is that this election was not a diagnostic of America. That's not what this election was. An election is a mobilization campaign. It tells us something about two parties who set out to mobilize, actually to create constituencies. They don't simply connect with a constituency and mobilize it. In the course of the campaign, over 18 months actually, people create constituencies. There's a lot of possibility for different combinations. No one has a single identity. I guess I am now a Washington elite, but I come from a working class family, and I'm an Italian. I've been different things at different points in my life. I've been a devout Catholic. I've been a socialist. So what identity do you call forward? I think in this mobilization campaign between the two parties, what we discovered is that one failed in calling forth a constituency and creating a winning constituency, and the other succeeded. I'm going to talk a little bit about the persona of the Trump campaign, and from there get into something about its foreign policy orientation. Trump ran as an anti-establishment insurgent, waging war on the new normal. And we know that term, that's been around for a while now. Really, it was a term that was meant to ease the American people into a more difficult way of living, sort of a recognition that growth had slowed, jobs were disappearing, the median family income had flatlined. Get used to it. This is part of what Trump was arguing against, certainly part of what people felt he was talking about. Another thing, authoritarian chauvinism, clearly, with a specific focus on Muslim Americans and Islam worldwide, and also on immigrants with a specific focus on Latinos. He also obviously sounded a populist theme. It reminded me of that old movement, the populist movement that is indigenous to America, of producerism. Basically a call out to all those people who contribute directly to the production of tangible wealth, or who facilitate the production of tangible wealth. And it likes to divide the world into two groups. Basically, you have producers and you have parasites. And I think that Trump uses that idea to pull forward all sorts of people who view themselves as producers. He targets the state as facilitating parasitic behavior. And of course, he himself sees himself as a builder. So part of his message is that we need to invest in building. Finally, there's what I'd call a narrow nationalist point of view. Some people say he's promoting realism, but it's not a realism that I recognize. It's certainly not a Henry Kissinger type of realism. It's not the type of realism that Stephen Walt promotes, not the type of realism that the Cato Institute promotes, or some of the fellows at MIT, a center of realist thinking. It's really, if anything, a kind of paleo-realism. It has a very idiosyncratic sense of what America's interests are. It has a very aggrieved feeling that America is aggrieved in the world. And it has an exaggerated sense of our prerogatives in the world. So it is not isolationism. It's not talking about come home America, it's talking about America first. But in doing that, I think that we can break it down into a couple of other themes that define it a bit more precisely. Trump has talked about reduced interventionism. He's not talking about not intervening anywhere. He obviously is very interested in going after what he calls radical Islam, wherever that exists. It extends beyond ISIS and Al-Qaeda to include Iran, more than likely. He's also seeing reducing commitments in various ways, actually renegotiating commitments with a number of our allies. Ideas of creating a new world order are out. A rule-based order, that's out. The idea of universal values, they don't exist, so that's out. This is what his reduced interventionism and his renegotiated commitments in the world mean. A second point, I would call it decisive unilateralism. We're not going to go out there often, but when we do go out there, it's going to be decisive. That's a code word for using military force, maximizing military force. And we've heard it at various points, carpet bombing and all the rest of that. And the final one sounds a bit like Fortress America, but he's not really talking about Fortress America in the way isolationists did. I would call it Armada America, creating a much more powerful military. His objective, as Richard was pointing out, is to dramatically increase defense spending. Whether he can accomplish that in the next 2 years, that's a question, principally because of the Budget Control Act. That will have to be rescinded. That's not going to happen in the next 2 years. So he's got to be looking to what's going to happen in 2018 when Democrats will face a real challenge in the Senate. I can remember I was teaching, just beginning to teach back in 1980 when Reagan was elected. And that was a devastating blow, not like this, but that was a devastating blow. And but we comforted ourselves with the assurance that he was only going to be around for 4 years. Didn't turn out that time, and don't believe it this time either. There will be a fight in 2018 over the Senate. He wins the Senate, then we can rescind the Budget Control Act. At that point, it becomes much easier to boost the Pentagon. Their objective, President Obama has already set the bar way above what the Budget Control Act said. What Trump says he will do is move it up probably by another $20 billion a year. So what we're looking at, if he had his way, next year's budget would be around $600 billion before we count the Overseas Contingency Fund. That would be a budget comparable, actually would exceed the highest budget of the Reagan era in inflation-corrected terms. And it would be the second highest budget since the end of World War II. There was one higher in 1952 when we had the emergency mobilization for Korea. So that's his objective there. But in some sense, you could think, well, isn't this just going to be a force that's all dressed up with nowhere to go? If you combine this sort of reduced interventionism with this gigantic force, what's the point? Well, part of the logic is that it stands as a force in being. And so that's my analogy to the Armada, that it's there for our use. But it also rolls back into his idea of building. Right? This is going to create jobs. It's not the best way to create jobs. We can create a lot more by using that money in other areas. But it will create jobs. It will create a powerful constituency. Expanding the military personnel-wise will also improve a constituency there, increase a constituency, all with an eye to going more than 4 years. So I think overall the theme of the campaign has been not so much come home America, but America first, and let's build. Let's focus on building. We will build our military, we will build our infrastructure. How is all of this going to be funded? Well, it's fabulism. There's really no explanation for how it's going to be funded. The hope, I mean, to the extent that he talks about it, the hope is that it's really back to supply side economics, that the economy is going to grow so much. But he also seems to have, we all know that debt control, that's for Democrats. And he has already indicated that he's not as concerned about debt. He's concerned about growth. So that's the appeal he makes. You know, I think that, I don't know if we regions later on, what he really wants to do in different places, but an important thing to recognize is that I've been talking about the persona of the campaign. There's the persona, and then there's the teleprompter. And the teleprompter, when he's speaking from the teleprompter, as he did in his major foreign policy address, he gets pulled back into what the President Obama has called the blog. He gets pulled back into the bipartisan consensus that has been basically defined by neoliberals and neocons. Now let's take a look at Team Trump. So far, he's only begun to build his administration, but there's a lot of names floating out there. And one thing that seems obvious to me is that he's moving in the same direction that Obama did, only in this sense. He's building a team of rivals. What's unique about his particular team of rivals is there's him and there's everybody else. That's the team. Who is the everybody else? Fairly standard hawks and neoconservatives. They are the team that he's building around him. And that is going to move his policy, I think, away from this notion of reduced interventionism to something like a milder form of neoconservatism. So we're actually going to see perhaps a bit of a mix of a Nixon approach to foreign policy. That would be the semi-realist portion, plus George W. Bush. But if you take a look at all of the folks he's concerned, there's very few that actually agree with him, especially on Russia. Mike Flynn, Lieutenant General Mike Flynn, is one who seems to agree with him on Russia. Senator Bob Corker doesn't agree there, but seems to be consistent with some of his other ideas, but everyone else are faces that we know and that we've learned to hate. So we may be seeing, in fair regard, a replication of what happened between 2000 and 2008. I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Carl. Carl just mentioned Russia, and before we open up the discussion to the audience, I wonder if Janie Galbraith, who has had very extensive relationships with our counterparts in Russia and has visited there as recently as earlier this year. David, would you come up and just say a few words to amplify what has been talked about so far?
Just say I'm addressing this topic in part because Mike Lind, who was to be on this panel, had a dental emergency and was unable to join us. But I will speak to the relationship with Russia. This is something with which our organization has been involved since the early 1990s, and so we experienced the trauma of the post-Soviet transition alongside Russian economist colleagues, and developed, I think, some understanding of the situation. I think the fact to remember now is that memories in Russia are long. The collapse of the USSR was not experienced in Russia the way the fall of the wall was experienced in Germany, or the transition in Poland or Czechoslovakia or the other East European states, or for that matter in the Baltic states. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a division, first of all, of the country, the loss of what had been a unified, large and powerful unified country, and followed by a massive rush for the spoils, and the privatization of the assets and the collapse of industrial production, of living standards, of life expectancies, an enormous rise in violence, alcoholism, and collapse of the society as a whole. And it has been a now 10-year period of recovery, 20-year period, I guess, practically, of recovery from that debacle since roughly 1998. The result of that is that there really is no yearning for Westernism in Russia. There is no yearning for a society like ours. It is much, the mood is much more of a desire to defend that which has been recovered, the national interest and the national independence. The second point I would make is that just much more recently, with the fall in energy prices and the general difficulties of the Russian economy, there was some fear in, let's say, professional circles that monitor these things closely, that Russian society would again begin to come apart. But the assessment that I was given last spring was that it did not happen. And that there is still a largely coherent popular and public mood. And so I think the message to take forward is that it is delusional to believe that the Russia of the 1990s, which was essentially a dependency, psychological and political dependency of the West, can be recreated. It will not happen. And therefore, one has to treat Russia as what it is, a strong and significant partner country with its own interests that have to be dealt with and respected, something which was recognized all through the Cold War, of course, but which was forgotten for a period afterwards. That seems to me to be the basic judgment I would draw from my experience there in recent times.
Good.
Thank you very much, Jamie. We'll now open the discussion to the audience. We have fixed microphones in a couple of places, and we have a couple of portable microphones as well. So if people want to raise a question with what was said, or comment, or challenge, or agree, please feel free. Yes, in the back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mark Harris, and I work for the United Methodist Church office. I wanted to ask you all about the military role in the U.S. economy. Are we so dependent upon military production that we just can't break from it?
Military production.
I'll say one thing. It is the one type of stimulus spending that Democrats and Republicans agree on. It's not. It's a larger part of our economy than it is of many other countries, but our economy is not dependent on it, except in that sense that if you want to have stimulus spending on a regular basis, here's the place that Democrats and Republicans can basically agree.
Can I say just a brief thing on that? It's certainly more of the Latin Americans, but there is an important issue that I always use when we discuss possibilities of progressive policy in Latin America. In the U.S., there's a peculiarity that industrial policy is done through the military. DARPA and all of those things, DARPANET, this could be streamlined because of, and it's a peculiarity of the American system, but that's a positive sort of spillover that we don't have. I mean, industrial policy has been killed around the globe because of several free trade agreements and bilateral investment agreements, and that's still very much alive in the U.S. because of this sort of peculiar feature of institutionality.
And if you want to do anything, do it through the military. You want to green America, green the military. Get that rolling, and it's absolutely right.
Sure, go ahead.
I wonder if someone could speak a little bit about NATO and what you see as a way that would be a progressive way to go forward. I mean, I know Trump has made some statements about NATO suggesting that he wants to pull back, and many of the blogs that I read are very progressive, are extremely critical of NATO and of the U.S. role in NATO. And so I wonder if you could comment on what you see as a really good way forward with NATO and what you think the possibilities of that would be under Trump.
Well, I'll make a brief comment and then ask Carl to comment further. It's not clear that Trump understands NATO and our relationship and the financial implications of that relationship. He seems to think that we can somehow get NATO to pay us for our involvement in their defense, as if they increased their payments to us, then we wouldn't be taken advantage of so much by them. And it's just a complete misunderstanding about the nature of each country's defense spending, its share of GNP, and whether they're spending enough. If they increase their spending, it would not necessarily result in our reducing our spending. So I think he has something to learn, hopefully, in the next short period. Carl, could you comment?
Well, yeah, a few things. I think that we do have a higher level of defense spending as a portion of GDP than do any of the other NATO countries. And we increasingly see ourselves as, or hoping to see ourselves in partnership with them to do things out of area. And this was the principal expansion that occurred in the 1990s, was really a double expansion. Let's expand eastward, and then let's change the mission of NATO so that we do things together outside of the area. And that's occurred to some extent. I mean, the expansion certainly occurred, but the sort of out-of-area operations have occurred to varying degrees, but still it's principally the United States operating around the world. So, I mean, if it were a true alliance, a true and a balanced alliance, I would see a different allotment of spending, but I would also see a different allotment of responsibility. It would be a different type of discussion going on inside of NATO, which might begin with, for the first time in history, having the Supreme Commander be somebody other than an American. You see, what Trump doesn't understand is that hegemony costs something. It gives you something, hopefully. That has been America's objective, but you also have to pay for it. So, in a certain sense, we obviously are spending more on the military than our partners are. On the other hand, we call the shots. So, that's an expense. He's not particularly interested, so he says, in hegemony. That's not his style of bullying. He's not the type that wants to get the whole group together and says, follow behind me and you'll have benefits. It's more like, if something concerns me, I'm going to go after it. So I think that we're already into Trump 3.0. Trump 1.0 was let's get rid of NATO. But now Trump 3.0 is that, we just want to sort of rejigger some of the spending. It intersects with his Russian policy, however, around around Ukraine and what future policy there will be. Are we going to lift sanctions on Russia? Are we going to pull back support from Ukraine? That's an open question. So I see trouble. Let's say troubled waters that I think everyone around Trump, that is to say Team Trump, they're going to smooth those waves. So we will see some change, but I don't think we'll see very, very substantial change. In terms of the way forward, I think that was part of the question, was a better way forward. Look, you know, we are so far down the wrong road that it's hard to even remember the road not taken. The road not taken would have been a road where we tried to build a common home of Europe, and where we would have tried to draw Russia in, take a chance, understand that drawing in a larger country like Russia into some sort of community arrangement would have altered the balance eventually, because everyone knew that Russia would eventually recover to some extent. That was the road not taken. I would have seen something like the OSCE growing in its importance and in its role, NATO shrinking in its role, not expanding eastward, but instead finding some other type of arrangement for the countries standing between Western Europe and Russia, and for us to try to attempt a different way forward. But we decided, rather than pursuing a peace dividend, I don't just mean money, I mean peace and stability dividend, we decided to pursue a power dividend. And there's a logic to it. It's easier to be a hegemon than it is to be a cooperator.
Thank you. We have time for 2 brief questions. Yes.
Hi, Joel Yudkin, High Road Strategies. Carl, you already kind of moved us in the right direction with my question about where do we really go from here? What should be our defense and security policy from this point on? I mean, it's one thing, and the left is very good at picking and looking at the pieces and challenging all that, but I keep on coming back to say, well, what should be our stance towards Russia? What should the level of defense? I don't believe we should have no defense. I think it's a question of what should it be, and so I'm left always with these kinds of discussions. Where do we, what is the alternative? And I think the Democrats themselves have lost their way in terms of trying to figure out what is our alternative. I mean, and so Bush, maybe it's too late with Bush, I don't know. But anyway, that's kind of been a little bit of frustration of mine for a long time.
Carl, you want to try that?
Well, just quickly, I mean, in a certain sense, it's the night of the election, the first thing I did was rip up everything I was going to say today, because it's all recalibrating since then, and I it's important to have that vision, but we've just taken a big step back. People have come together, and I've worked with the Progressive Caucus in Congress, worked with Barney Frank, and we've worked with Cato Institute to develop different ideas. Recently, Cato came up with a program. There's a series. It was put out by the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, which is a conservative group. But they brought together several different organizations to plan different ideas of what might our military look like. Cato was the only one that came down low and below current levels, and I think that they targeted $450 billion a year. Now we're talking about going to $600 billion, so that is a significant reduction. But it really depends on what you want to do in the world. It really depends on what you want to do. If you have a more cooperative approach, then you rely less on your military, you rely more on others. We've had an approach, in my opinion, in our foreign policy, which highlights contention with Russia and China. That basically we have pushed up against their borders and they have reacted. We overplayed primacy. What happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union was a singularity. It could not last. It was based on China not developing further and Russia having no restoration of its power. And consequently pushed up against their borders, now they're pushing back. So we've started a process of global repolarization and remilitarization, and that leads to very high military budgets. If you had a different approach, you could have much lower budgets. And of course, even in today's circumstance, you can argue that the military is just interested in stuffing its pockets. Even with the current plan or the current approach to the world, I don't think we need the military we're talking about. If you want, on the other hand, to talk about taking over countries and occupying them For long periods of time, not just Iraq, but Afghanistan and Syria and maybe Libya, well then that's a different story. You have to add hundreds of thousands of troops and much more money, but nobody's seriously contemplating that, or at least they're not talking about it in public.
Final question, yes.
I'm a retired economist, a microeconomist from the South University, David George. I have only been attracted to the international scene since I retired. And I'll just give you some background quickly. I read something by Stephen Kaufman about the month before I retired. That's 2 years and 5 months back. And I was shocked. And since that time, I've gone through several things, having the luxury of retirement, including Carnegie Institute, where was a presentation by the former ambassador of the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, and some others. I'm one who kind of have been on a retiree's luxury of reading everything I can. I'm very, very, very disturbed at the New York Times, Washington Post, and the stories we made up. Just one point. In the 90s, all evidence suggests that we were a major force behind alienating Russia. In fact, when I was president of a very small association for Social Economics in 2005, I tried to get us to express concerns with the then president, who I'm sorry, his name I'm forgetting, the Russian younger person who was the president, who was a major force from Harvard, who did a lot of nasty things that Harvard made a huge settlement for. To get to my point, I guess I can go on forever here, I won't do that. Can you comment on my deep concerns that there's a lot of things we've received that are just not true? I do not trust the Times any longer. I read it every day, and I'm deeply bothered. Any comments about those events would be appreciated.
Yes,
Not to, I wanted to compliment something that, he said before that I was telling Mark, part of the move to the right in Latin America and all of this sort of judicial mediatic coups is that in every single country after those happen, over the last 10, 12, 13 years of left of center governments, military bases in Latin America had sort of vanished. In every single place you have again, the reintroduction of American military bases, in the region. And I don't expect any sort of change in that kind of policy in the near future.
Yeah, I would like to say something about your reading of the Times and the Post, and I think it is the media here, and the New York Times really reads now almost like it's the 1950s in terms of the Cold War kind of things. It just had an editorial 2 days ago about the dangers of Trump being soft on Russia, and I think if I'm really worried that the Democratic leadership will go along with that kind of view, and it could be very self-defeating for them. George W. Bush, I think that one of his main reasons for the buildup towards the Iraq War in 2002 was to ensure that Republicans would get the Congress. They pushed some may remember, that all the other issues that were going to be in the campaign that would have hurt them were just completely knocked off the political discussion. And it was successful. And then, of course, he was able to win re-election because voters didn't want to switch presidents in the middle of this war. And so I think it's a very dangerous thing politically here at home to have that kind of McCarthyism, Cold War, aggressive, trying to outflank him from the right on foreign policy, which could very easily happen if he decides to pursue a less aggressive policy anywhere. And so that's what I'm worried about.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank the panel for a very interesting and provocative discussion. And we'll move on to our next panel.
The reference just at the end of the last session to the 1950s reminds me of two things that have not really been discussed. One was that, of course, we still live in the era of nuclear weapons. As Dan Ellsberg, who spoke to a dinner organized by this organization in January, reminded us the danger that that fact poses has not gone away and is in some respects becoming more serious as we pay less attention to it, as it is less central to our understanding of our relations with other powers around the world, powers that have nuclear weapons, powers that we suspect or accuse of attempting to acquire them, powers who don't have them, but against whom we might be tempted for some reason to use them. This is a danger which we all need to be aware of. And in that context, I'm reminded of something that my father wrote. It was a line that he drafted for the inauguration of John F. Kennedy in 1961. And it was the famous line that read, "We must never negotiate from fear, but we must never fear to negotiate." I mention it because it's my pleasure right now to introduce our keynote speaker, William Goodfellow, president of the Center for International Policy, who has been, through my entire professional life, a voice of reason, sanity, and a witness on these questions. His work extends from